Welcome to another edition of Consensus Unreality. Before we get to tonight's interview, I'm going to ask you to check out patreon.com/consensusunreality. For just $5 a month, you can access our full episode archive, 5 years worth that's only hosted there. Regular exclusive episodes, which are ongoing and exclusively hosted at patreon.com/consensusunreality. Written content, a Discord server, and if you join our print tier club, you get access to our printed Journal of Shells, plus other printed and recorded materials in the mail. That's really cool, so check that out. Thanks for listening. As always, enjoy the episode.
Well, we'll talk about whatever you're working on. Are you doing something like cryptid type stuff right now?
Yes. Well, I'm just getting started doing something with cryptid stuff. So I've been like interested in cryptozoology forever, basically, like since I was a little kid, and like all, freaky little kids, interested in the 90s, I like early 90s, I guess. And so like 3 years ago, I was invited by Amy Hale, who is an author who has written about she's like a scholar of like esotericism and the arts, and she was curating this series of lectures at this museum in London called the Wind Museum, and she asked me if I would give a talk about anthropology and cryptozoology. And at first I was like, I can try to figure something out. Like that sounds kind of interesting. And I've done a lot of work on Bigfoot and anthropology. That's what I did kind of like a harebrained senior thesis on in undergrad. And since then I've like kept working on this, and I've kept sort of like trying to just like keep up with any sort of scholarly stuff that happens around Bigfoot. And I was doing this like just before the Animal Planet show Finding Bigfoot came out, which was in 2012. And since then, it's like exploded, and it's like completely different. And there's this huge like ecosystem of podcasts, most notably like Sasquatch Chronicles and other stuff that have really like transformed it. But so I was pretty familiar with like the Bigfoot world and Bigfoot people, but I didn't really know what I was going to work on with anthropology and cryptozoology. So I asked Amy, I was like, "Do you want me to do something on Bigfoot?" And she was like, I really think it would be cool if we could try to do something more general about anthropology and cryptozoology." And I was like, "All right, like I'll give it a shot." And so I started like digging into just like the canonical cryptozoological literature. So like Bernard Heuvelmans, Ivan T. Sanderson, Roy Mackal. There's a lot of stuff in French, which I don't read French very well, so I kind of had to plod my way through it. But and again and again, it was really amazing. Like almost all of what kind of became cryptozoology in the 20th century really emerges out of these just like writings from the colonial period and like ethnographic writings. And it was usually pretty similar stories, like some like colonial administrator, usually British, would be hearing about this sort of like special kind of being from a local traditional group of people, and he would get this idea in his head that he was about to discover this new species of whatever, and he was going to make a name for himself by doing so. And usually these sort of stories and the memoirs or like reports written by these colonial administrators and explorers would become like the source text for by the 20th century becomes a canonical cryptid. So there's tons and tons of examples. I mean, the Yeti is one example of this. One of like my favorite examples is this South Asian like water dragon creature called the Buru. Mostly in what is now like sort of like a southern part of Nepal. And this colonial administrator really thought, and hearing stories about the Buru, he was really, really confident that he was going to discover a new species of like semi-aquatic monitor lizard in Nepal and really make a name for himself. And of course, there was no monitor lizard, but the story has legs and it keeps going, and people keep mounting expeditions for the Buru. And so like this is one example of like a case that I found a huge amount of material on where uh, there are still anthropologists working in these areas, and in some cases they realize that there's like in some cases, centuries of writing by random Westerners about a very specific like spiritual being that they're from their field site. So we have like an Italian anthropologist who's working in southern Nepal, and he realizes that British people have been writing about Buru for like a century. And so this particular anthropologist, whose name I wish I could remember off the top of my head, wrote this article about how basically British colonial administrators failed to sort of clearly understand that the Buru is really kind of like one of these like primordial cosmic water dragons who has this sort of function in like creating and maintaining the world in this traditional cosmology. But, and this is really interesting, they still exist, and in these traditional cosmologies, like you can go find them, people see them, you can go look for them, and it was just this really interesting series of events that occurred again and again throughout the literature that became cryptozoology, where you would have usually a colonial, well, always a colonial, but usually a British colonist or ethnographer hearing about this like animal-like being whose nature was basically spiritual, and sort of misinterpreting it as an animal that hasn't been discovered yet. And then this sort of like harebrained attempt to discover this animal, which by the 1950s, 1960s, guys like Heuvelmans and Sanderson suddenly revive, and in a context, associated with like Nessie and Sasquatch and Yeti. And we get this like fully developed Western phenomena of cryptozoology, which I think like really emerges from this haphazard attempt to superimpose, like modern scientific sort of like forms of understanding the natural world over traditional, what I would call like traditional or indigenous cosmologies or ways of relating to the natural world. And again, they produce this like unwieldy selection of creatures who, and it's interesting, who people really do see. And what makes, I think, like the literature even more interesting is like, there are cases of, in many, many cases, it's not just the traditional people who are like having encounters with these beings, right? It's not just the thing that I think makes the cryptozoological literature more interesting than just another case of like a modern failure to understand a traditional knowledge system is like people really seem to have like cryptozoological encounters in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different ways. And like I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that, or I should say I should say what I think is that like this literature that we've been calling cryptozoology is actually this like enormous artifact of our modern way of relating to the natural world, and the impoverishment of that modern way of doing so, compared to these other sort of like traditional and indigenous cosmologies. And I don't, claim to fully understand what these encounters mean or how we should understand them, right? But yeah, there's just a lot to sort of dig into and try to understand there. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about with cryptozoology, and hopefully one of these days it'll be a short book or something.
Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. It feels like there's something. I know that you spoke a little bit about the British intrigue into that Nepalese mythology, but it does feel that there's something like eccentrically American about cryptozoology, like stumbling in the dark of a strange land. Do you kind of find echoes of that? And I also kind of wanted to see if you had looked into the Bigfoot flap in Pennsylvania as well, us sharing that state here.
Definitely, yeah. There is, so I would say there is an American cryptozoology, which is doing its own thing for sure. I think that what's interesting about like so the like the big cryptozoological names, guys like Heuvelmans is French, Ivan T. Sanderson is Scottish, although he ends up settling in the United States for a while and actually ends up um, not too far from Pennsylvania, actually. He ends up buying a little house and creating a small animal zoo in like northwestern New Jersey near like Blairstown. He's only like 45 minutes from like Easton. Um,
Huh.
and so this is the guy who, Ivan Sanderson writes Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, which
Yeah.
really codifies like the Yeti and Bigfoot thing into one sort of like pseudoscience. And I don't use that term like derisively, I guess. I should note that. But um and so a lot of the first generation of like cryptozoologists or European guys, there definitely ends up being a distinctly American cryptozoology in the latter half of the 20th century with I think like I guess Lauren Coleman is really like the paradigmatic American
Yeah.
cryptozoologist. He wrote this really famous book in the 80s, Mysterious America, and then he's written a lot since then. Um, and he's also along with like a few other guys, Mark A. Hall, he he does some of the first and there's many other names that I could mention, but some of the first like plumbing American newspapers from like the early 20th and 19th centuries for cryptid reports of Bigfoot and wild men, reports of like water monsters, reports of giant birds, reports of Black Panthers, things like this. And they really like kind of gin up this huge literature that becomes grist for the mill of cryptozoology in the 20th century. There is, but I mean, I get the sense that you're talking more about like a kind of like American adventurism with cryptozoology. And for sure there is like there's this one guy, he was a Texas oil tycoon basically named Tom Slick, who in the 50s and 60s became obsessed with the Yeti and the abominable snowman. And he funded a ton of expeditions to the Himalayas to look for the Yeti, look for the abominable snowman. And he funded a few other kind of like freakier expeditions too. There was an expedition to this mountain range in California called the Trinity Alps to look for giant salamanders. I guess a few people saw giant salamanders and if you Google Trinity Alps giant salamander, there's some interesting stuff to dig into there. The other Some of the other like American crypto stuff which is unique is a lot of the big time American Bigfoot research guys um, have been Mormon, which of course is like a uniquely sort of like American religion, obviously American religion, American sort of like offshoot from Christianity, but Mormon there's a scholar. His last name is Bowman. I think it's Matthew Bowman. I wish I had these names in front of me. Who has written a few pieces about how in sort of like Mormon American folklore, the Bigfoot is associated with the biblical Cain. So one of the biblical sons of Adam and Eve who murders his brother Abel and is sort of like cast out of polite society. And the reason that Cain is associated with Bigfoot and Mormon folklore is because there was this early Mormon leader. He was one of I think it was like Joseph Smith's version of the 12 apostles, this original, they called it like the quorum of the 12 of these followers of Joseph Smith, a guy named David Patton, who claimed to have had an encounter with Cain, the biblical Cain, in Tennessee in the 1830s, if I'm not mistaken. And he said that he was completely covered in hair. He was like an enormous, dark figure who was covered in hair. And so there's this like persistent thing in Mormon folklore where Bigfoot is taken, I think, just a little bit more seriously, right? I
Sure.
don't think that many of these, like, Jeff Meldrum is one example. He's like one of the big time physical anthropologist, scientist guys. He also happens to be Mormon. I don't think that Jeff Meldrum thinks that Bigfoot reports are reports of people seeing the biblical Cain, right? But I think like in sort of like Mormon culture, there's a tendency to just like take Bigfoot a little bit more seriously. So an anthropologist like Meldrum is less uh, less inclined to sort of just like instantly reject some of these reports.
Mm.
So there's definitely an American cryptozoology thing, but like, I mean, it definitely is like a European. It has roots in sort of like European colonialism and anthropology.
Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, there's also that interest in the Nephilim as well in Mormonism, looking for the giants and connecting them to the mound builders and such. That's really interesting. Was it the Popcorn Zoo that Ivan Sanderson ran?
I don't know if it was called so the one like photograph that I've seen of it, it was called Ivan Sanderson's Jungle Zoo.
Okay.
And it was right along the Delaware River.
Yes, I know
Um,
Blairstown. Yeah, I know it quite well,
yeah,
actually.
it
Yeah.
was right along the Delaware River, and yeah,
It's
actually,
crazy.
so I did a little bit of exploring there. My wife's from Blairstown, actually, so I actually don't tell anybody this, but I snuck onto his former property, the place he lived in the 70s, and it was the headquarters of this organization he ran, the Society for the Society for Investigation of the Unexplained, SITU, kind of a clunky
Oh man,
acronym. But
that was
yeah,
still
but
there.
yeah, well, no, the shed was still there, but I've talked to a few people like from the area who have told me like when Sanderson's wife died, and then he died a few years later, and for like a decade, nobody bothered to come and pick up any of this of the SITU stuff. And it was just kids would just come and like mess with it and take stuff for like years and years, which is like super tragic story
Yeah,
and like classic, UFO paranormal archive just completely imploding upon the death of the collector, like as
yeah,
unfortunately happens so often. Um, but yeah, but I saw, he made a map when SITU was active, and I kind of snuck onto the property, and I sort of like found some places on the map, and there was I forget exactly which book he included the map in, but there was one little area on his map where there was a structure that he labeled the experimental shed. So I went and I found the experimental shed, but I don't know what kind of stuff went down in the experimental shed.
Huh.
Yeah,
Yeah, Eugenia Macer's story had some UFO
yeah,
investigations in that region too. So maybe
really.
Ivan
yeah.
Sanderson,
What do you know about that?
maybe
Just kidding.
he conjured up some invisible residents that
Yeah,
continued on in the area.
yeah. I was gonna
He,
say she was published pretty often in Pursuit, so I which was the journal of SICU, and so I
yeah.
am familiar with the journal. I did not know it was situated so close. That's so interesting.
Ben, is that my I'm not able to like put all these names together. Is that the artist
Yeah,
who you've worked on and who you compiled some of
yeah.
her work? That's
Artist and
amazing.
writer, and yeah, she's a Fortean, or not even.
Right.
She was
Hmm.
like a psychic who wrote on topics that often intersected with Fortean and ufological concerns. So she would be
Right.
in issues of Pursuit or Borderlands once in a while, Borderland Sciences, and sort of other journals like that. She had a brief MUFON newsletter out of New York City that sort of
Really?
evolved into her own newsletter called Magic Mirror. And so she kind of was always in that realm while also kind of being an outsider within an outsider within an outsider realm, I guess. Uh,
Yeah. That's
yeah,
that's so cool. I wish, yeah, I mean it's such a tragedy that like that archive was like pulled apart. Although I should say I think actually some of the stuff was picked up in New Jersey, and the last I heard it's in Michigan. It's in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the collection of Michael Swords, the
Hmm.
ufologist.
yeah, yeah. There's
Um
the a guy I know has been looking at that stuff. Yeah,
yeah.
and yeah, I guess it's a lot of it's there. This other guy, John Reed, I don't know if you know him.
Mm-mm.
Um, he's I got a bunch of those Mesa story paintings from him. He was an
Oh,
archivist of
cool.
this stuff. Once, when somebody died, he would go immediately and see what he could get. So he ended up with a bunch of her paintings. But he has been working, I don't know if he still is, this was a few years ago. He's been working to digitize like all of Pursuit and all of the stuff to
Oh,
do with any of that he could get his hands on. And he had like crazy archives. I wonder if he might have given it to, because he was in way up in Michigan.
okay.
So maybe he was, anyway, that's all kind
Yeah.
of shop talk. But yeah, it's kind of, it is, I have a lot of feelings about the way these archives are kind of basically like dumpster bound pretty quickly.
Totally. Me too. I mean, well, one of the things, so I went to grad school at this school called Rice University in
Mm.
Texas, and one of the things that I did there was I helped set up this archive that of like American paranormal and UFO history that eventually became uh it's called the Archives of the Impossible. But it's pretty cool, and we collected a lot of stuff, and they continue to collect a ton of stuff. And there are so many archives, just like you said, Ben, that like um they're just dumpster bound. Like you have
Yeah.
someone who has like worked on something their whole life, they pass away, their kids, very often like wish they could do something, but like what can you do with like a garage full of dad's remote viewing sketches, right? Or or something like this. And yeah, and no one has really like bothered to hang on to them except like enthusiasts and people like us basically. So yeah, there's tons of stuff
Yeah.
that just disappeared.
Um, there's a ufologist up here. He lives in the Poconos, Paris Flamand. If you come into,
Hmm.
have you seen
I don't
that
think
name?
so.
He
No.
he wrote like two or three, like mass market paperback UFO books, and also a pretty like rare and sought after book about the JFK assassinations. All these things always
Whoa,
kind of
cool.
mixed together. But his stuff, the same thing happens, and I got some of it. Um, like this handwritten sheet music that he did for a song that he wrote called "My Night in the Flying Saucer," like stuff like
That's awesome.
so. But yeah, so often this stuff is lost, which I think is a an important conversation to have. Even if they get into the hands of like morally dubious booksellers, it's better
Yeah,
than the garbage.
right.
Like me, I mean. But um, yeah, I guess also we are joined today by Timothy Grieve-Carlson.
Yeah.
It's those movies where they have the credits like halfway through.
Yeah.
It's like that.
Nice.
So you're working so you're kind of like in cryptozoology terrain right now, or what else have you been working on?
Yeah, I finished a draft of a book. It's called Contact Zone: Supernature and Culture in the Big Thicket. And it's about this place in Texas. It's this bioregion in Southeast Texas called the Big Thicket. And this is a book, it's sort of hard to describe. It's definitely like an academic book, but it's about this place in Texas and how paranormal phenomena and ecology kind of are related to one another in this particular place. So it's this small little bioregion where a bunch of different ecosystems overlap. It's really significant in a few like strange historical ways. It is the place where the American oil industry kind of got its start. And it's the place that was the center of this like really robust conservation movement in the 70s. And it's just really interesting from a number of different perspectives, but it's super haunted in a ton of different ways. I mean, there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings, a lot of Black Panther sightings, a lot of UFO reports. The Cash Landrum incident
Oh yeah.
um, was depending on where you put the borders of the big thicket, either inside it or just outside of it. Um, and then the most kind of like famous and I think interesting paranormal thing going on in there is this um, local ghost light or spook light on this stretch of dirt road called Bragg Road.
Huh.
And this is an 8 mile dirt road where this ball of light comes out basically every night and moves around. And it I find it super interesting because it is so reliable, and everybody who's lived out there has written about it, and there's a ton of like different interesting stuff written about it. Um, and so yeah, I wrote this like kind of short academic book about the Big Thicket and how I think like experiences we call paranormal are essentially like sort of related to the cryptozoology stuff now that I'm thinking about them out loud together. The reason that experiences that we call paranormal become kind of like excluded and rejected and difficult to talk about in the modern period has something to do with the way that like human beings sort of reorganize their subjectivity, their sense of themselves during the same period, and sort of like thought of themselves as autonomous individuals who really existed inside their heads, rather than sort of like beings who had this sort of like porous kind of subjectivity with the world around them. And so I try to, read this one sort of like tiny place very intensely to try to make this like big claim that I think, the what we call the paranormal is basically like this artifact of a sudden kind of like disorganization in our thinking that happened a few hundred years ago.
Huh.
So yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I like that. Huh. And so you're kind of, and then the book that you had published a year or so ago, the American Aurora, right? That also kind of focuses on environmental kind of concerns alongside mystical and religious, paranormal concerns. Is that so? That's kind of where you're looking most of all in your sort of studies.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, like, I guess pretty much everything I've worked on has t had a different topic and like used it to say like a similar thing, right? That the paranormal is basically like environmental category and environmental kind of experience, and the reason that it's so difficult to like talk about or think about, or the reason we have to use words like anomalous to talk about it, is because our own sort of like environmental sensibilities are kind of like screwed up, right? Um, yeah, so American Aurora came out last year. It came out about a year ago, and this was it was based on my PhD research, and it's about, in particular, this guy, famous Philadelphian Johannes Kelpius, kind of a religious refugee, I would say, and who eventually ends up becoming a sort of legendary hermit in the greater Philadelphia area. And yeah, one of my big interests, like I said, I grew up in Lebanon, so I knew kind of like Eastern Pennsylvania really well. And when I started reading about like the history of American religions for graduate school, I kept seeing Eastern PA stuff come up again and again. And it was always in like a similar context of like um the freakiest people who ever lived were in Eastern Pennsylvania, right? And
Yeah.
historically there's good reasons for that. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Pennsylvania was one of like a very small number of places where the state did not reserve the right to like imprison or kill you for believing something weird. And so lots of weirdos ended up here. Um, and I was interested in a bunch of those weirdos, and I still am, and there's still like a ton of early Pennsylvania stuff to um, that I'd like to dig into deeper at some point. But yeah, Kelpius just really stood out, and he stood out to me especially once I actually like read stuff he wrote, where he described, as you said, a lot of his own sort of like religious experiences and perspective, his own sort of form of Christian mysticism, and also his own really severe interest in what he would call like miracles or miraculous phenomena, and I would call sort of anachronistically in some ways kind of paranormal phenomena. So he was very so he's not, he was a German pietist, which was this sort of like radical kind of movement within Lutheranism in the 17th century, and um, almost like completely the opposite of sort of like New England Puritans in the way they understood supernatural, paranormal, miraculous experiences, right? Whereas for a guy like Cotton Mather, anything supernatural is evidence of kind of like diabolical attention and intervention. And for people like Kelpius, it was totally the opposite. It was just like, and they get this from books like Acts of the Apostles. Anytime something supernatural takes place, that's evidence that God is with you and is paying close attention. It's actually a good thing. And so these guys all become really sort of obsessed with paranormal, supernatural, miraculous events. And so one event that really like stood out to me and still stands out to me is in one letter written in 1699. Kelpius is describing some of like the miracles that he saw firsthand among the pietists in Europe, and he says that some people in these ecstatic states they could hear the thoughts of the people who were around them, even people that they had never met before. Um, and this super jumped out at me because I think that's like unambiguously a description of something that eventually we would call telepathy in the 19th and 20th century. And I think that might be the earliest description of something called telepathy anywhere. Um, at least understood as a faculty of mind where the private thoughts of one individual are legible to another individual without writing or speaking them. And so tons of stuff like that. The other big thing that really interested me about Kelpius in relation to the modern paranormal is he was obsessed with celestial phenomena, and in particular, kind of like anomalous celestial phenomena. So, um, in in another letter, he basically tells one of his correspondents that one of his main sort of like religious activities is just paying attention to the sky and waiting for sort of like strange things to show up. And sometimes they do. There's, the other interesting thing about Kelpius is after he dies, it seems like everybody in Philadelphia starts writing a ton of crazy stuff about this guy. So it's really hard to know what is true about him and what is a legend about him after he's dead. And that's a lot of what I did in the book was I tried to lay out like, here's what I think we can say for sure about this guy. Here's what I think is definitely not true. Here's what I'm not sure about. But there's, in terms of like what we would now call psychic phenomena, and I think also kind of what we would now call like the UFO phenomena. Kelpius is sort of this like American kind of like taproot for a lot of that stuff. And even though most people who remember Kelpius have, through no fault of their own, a sort of like distorted memory of him or like a memory warped by legend, nonetheless, he he was truly the kind of guy that people wanted to make up legends about, right? Because he was like an interesting, special, unique individual, who I do think had this sort of like early role in seeding a lot of this like freaky stuff in the Eastern United States. Yeah.
Super cool, yeah, because the Hermitage in the Wissahickon is really not that far from the center of Philadelphia, and yet they were living a pretty ascetic lifestyle out there, right?
They definitely were, yeah. So as far as I can tell, every primary source reference to the Hermitage that was written while the Hermitage that was written like less than 100 years after it happened, just describes like a simple cottage. So it was probably just like a small house that some people put together. It probably wasn't like a huge facility. Um, yeah, and they were 100% living a very ascetic lifestyle. One of the things that made them stand out, that made Kelpius in particular like so strange, even in a place like Pennsylvania, which is attracting all of these already very weird people, was he he really like modeled his own personal Christianity off of what he understood to be like the religious life of like the earliest Christians and major
Mm.
figures from the Bible. Um, so he probably committed, well, almost certainly committed to like a very rigorous like prayer and meditation schedule. He wore a hair shirt. He wore like a special garment that would make him permanently uncomfortable. Um, so he stood out, he would have stood out like really intensely in that way. When he went into town, it would have looked like he was wearing a costume, basically. Um, and yeah, and also we know like he was committed to like a celibate lifestyle. We think, but he also wrote some of the most like I would say like graphically erotic poetry. I don't want to say in all of Christian history because that's like a really long history, but I mean, if you're familiar with like the eroticism of a lot of like medieval Christian poetry, Kelpius is a lot less subtle than that. So he's definitely like he steps up some of the eroticism in his own poetry. But nonetheless, he at least so far as we know, was committed to this like monastic celibate lifestyle. So yeah, he definitely considered himself to be like a monk in the really like early Christian sense, like someone who had like turned his back on the world and was completely sort of like committed to a contemplative lifestyle.
What do you see as like some of the foundations of his brand of ecstatic theogony, like his kind of his brand of that ecstatic Christian faith? Like what are some of the influences that got him there?
Yeah, so Kelpius is coming up in a pretty like radical and wacky like esoteric Christian milieu. So he really important figure to him is the German Protestant mystic Jakob Boehme, who is sort of like the paradigmatic Protestant mystic. He has this like series of pretty extreme religious visions when he is a young man, and he basically spends the rest of his life trying to put them into words, just trying to understand them. I think like really analogous to a figure like Philip K. Dick, and his, the material that eventually becomes the exegesis. He has this handful of experiences that he just can't help but try to understand for the rest of his life. That's Boehme. He's also really influenced by what I would call like Christian Christian alchemy and Christian astrology. And um it's easy to forget that things like alchemy and astrology were pretty normal and respectable, and for most of the 17th century it wasn't necessarily an occult interest. It's not really until the early 18th century that astronomy and chemistry kind of consolidate and really firmly tip those things over into being uh, not not respectable pursuits. But Kelpius is like influenced by a Christian worldview where, in alchemical terms, the matter of this world is suffused with spirit. And in celestial terms, right, the heavens themselves are really like a legible text in which like divine forces are communicating all the time. So he's influenced by those. Um, and also, I mean, there was just so much like of what we would now call occultism in the water of Christianity. One case I tried it. So, in the book, I point out that someone Kelpius definitely read was a Protestant author named Johann Arndt, who wrote a book in the year 1600 called True Christianity, which was probably the most popular Protestant book ever written. It was easily the most popular Protestant book in Germany in the 17th century. And a huge portion of that book was simply plagiarized from the Swiss alchemist Paracelsus and Paracelsus's own kind of like Christian alchemical and occult sort of like understandings of the world, the human body, and the human spirit and the universe. And so this is really Kelpius's milieu. Kelpius is an extreme and radical figure. He gets a PhD, but pretty much immediately associates himself with some of the most radical pietists in Europe. So much so that I basically think he fled. There's this mythology about Kelpius that he was the leader of a doomsday cult and they thought the world was going to end. Um, by the time that the date that is usually associated with that claim already passed before they got to Pennsylvania, and literally every Christian in Christian history thinks the world is about to end. So Kelpius wasn't that unique in that sense. He certainly wasn't the leader of a doomsday cult. But I think he did flee Europe under um, like threat of imprisonment or banishment or something like this. I think he does have to leave Germany. Um, and he arrives in Pennsylvania, and one thing that makes him stand out as a weirdo, even among kind of like the radical esoteric Christian groups of the time, is he immediately insists on this really like biblical ascetic lifestyle. He really tries to model his life off of figures like Moses, the prophet Elijah, and John the Baptist. And he continuously kind of tells people who write to him, I'm trying to like model my own lifestyle on the lifestyle of these guys. So even like as radical as he is, he is in some ways pretty conservative, and compared to other radical Christians of the time, Kelpius actually keeps things pretty biblical. Like he really is trying to like be a John the Baptist style figure. Um, and but of course, at the same time, like his there's this great one chapter of the book is just dedicated to interpreting this one letter he wrote in 1706 called The Threefold Wilderness State, where he describes like his I would say like his developed, mature theology. And in that letter, it's basically like an alchemical reading of biblical history, of human spiritual development, and of like human life on Earth, in which the human soul needs to be refined in an alchemical way. And the only way to do this is through like prolonged contemplative ascetic practice in a wilderness setting. Um, and it's all like the whole it is like a metaphorical mysticism, and the metaphor is basically alchemical, that the human soul and body is a substance, and you have to improve it using using sort of these techniques. So yeah, Kelpius was both like a product of his time, but also special in certain ways.
Yeah. Who were some of the other, I mean, so the Moravians were out here. There was who else was kind of in this zone that made Eastern Pennsylvania at that time so strange?
There were so many. I mean, the Moravians are huge. The Moravians are also a pietist group, but they're like a few decades, yeah, a few decades after Kelpius. And at this point, a lot of what made pietism super radical had sort of been absorbed into mainstream Lutheranism. Also, a lot of the like alchemical and astrological beliefs had also sort of like subsided. Alongside, but still, I mean, they're still like a radical, I would say, like mystical Christian group. Some of the other big ones, what someone who was actually a close friend and associate of Kelpius's was an English astrologer named Christopher Witt, who and the a close friend of Kelpius, but the reason he stands out to me is he in the correspondence of two early American botanists, a guy named John Bartram. So, and if anyone listening in Philly has ever been to Bartram's Garden, that's the John Bartram. And in one of John Bartram's letters, he says, according to my friend Christopher Witt, people who love each other sincerely can actually communicate with their thoughts over great distances. So we have, I think that's the second oldest description of what we would call telepathy anywhere in history. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's real cool.
Other like true like weirdos who stand out, a French doctor named George de Benville, who was an early Christian Universalist who settled in part of what is now Berks County near Oley, Berks County. Um, and he was also really interested in alchemy, astrology, and he also wrote and published this really amazing narrative of his near-death experience. If anyone Googles it, the phrase "the life and trance of George de Benville," you can read his account of when he dies and goes to heaven. But it's a very weird heaven. It's a freaky heaven that George de
Sounds
Benville
good.
goes to. But he ends up being like a leader of this like loose knit collection of religious radicals around Oley and Berks County. And this community, I think, is really interesting and really hard to study because they never, the people of Oley, Pennsylvania, That seems to be the place you went where if you were like too weird to kind of like settle down anywhere else in PA. And the reason I think that is because of the memoirs of this Lutheran missionary, Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, who goes to Ole and he preaches for a few days there. And he's basically like, this is straight up Sodom and Gomorrah on earth. Like you've never heard of people more weird than the people of Ole, Pennsylvania. And there's other sources that describe, after referring to the people of Ole, there's this euphemism for atheism in Pennsylvania, which people just call it the Pennsylvania religion. So I think like were those people described like atheists? I don't know. Were they probably like really, really strange? Definitely. Um, Other people, of course, the Ephrata community just outside of
Yeah.
Lancaster, the leader of that community, a guy named Conrad Beisel, he actually traveled to Pennsylvania from Germany trying to apprentice himself to Kelpius.
Right.
Kelpius had been dead for 13 years by the time he got there. Eventually, he starts his own community, which gets way bigger than anything Kelpius tried. And Beisel and his community actually wrote a ton. They became super influential. They wrote a ton of stuff. I think like some of the more interesting beliefs that Beisel got really interested in. Beisel was really into like the gender of God, and gender is sort of like a reflection of human spiritual existence. And in Beisel's understanding, what Christians call the fall, so like the catastrophic like decline of paradise in Genesis, was not simply the destruction of the Garden of Eden. It was the collapse of sort of like the perfect human being who was androgynous into the conditions that we call male and female today. And in Beisel's understanding, God had both like a male and a female aspect. The female aspect of God was called Sophia, and Sophia was a major figure in the religion of Ephrata. And the goal of every Christian at Ephrata was to kind of like restore part of being saved in a Christian sense at Ephrata meant like restoring one's original perfect androgyny. Um, so pretty interesting
That is
18th century.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would they
Yeah.
have been exposed to, I mean, they must have been exposed to some of the Valentinian stuff, right? Or was it more like medieval kind of French romantic, like medieval to romantic, chivalric kind of stuff, or a little bit of both?
It's a great question that I do not know the answer to. I do not think that the Ephrata community had any access um, to any Valentinian literature. I
I
do
guess,
think. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no, yeah, I guess you have some of the Sophionic stuff is preserved into like the Byzantine era as well. But yeah, that's so fascinating that that was right there because I knew about the cloisters, but I had no idea that that was it's such a Gnostic philosophy, you know?
It is. Yeah. Well, I hesitate to like full and of course like there were a bunch of different
Yeah,
groups called Gnostic, and I hesitate to say like, this 18th century group is definitively Gnostic or not
sure.
Gnostic. No doubt about it. Like devotion to Sophia is appears for the first time in this huge like I would say there was no Christian group as devoted to Sophia until Ephrata, stretching back to the Gnostics, right? I think that's probably true. I think that like where they get Sophia, Sophia does come from like the Hebrew Bible, like this personification of God's
Mhm.
wisdom, which is gendered feminine in Hebrew. And I think that there were other like medieval and ancient Christian sources that they probably pulled it from. But the following like the Renaissance, a lot of Hermetic material was available in translation, and it was
Right,
it
right.
was in translation in kind of like Christian context and an esoteric context. So there's a few places it could have come from. Um, but yeah, I don't. Somebody should look at that. I don't
Yeah,
know off the top of
even
my head. Yeah.
yeah, the way that you talk about the re sort of the dissemination of the sexes through something like a pleroma, which is a Gnostic term for like that
Yes.
integrated state. That just sounds super Valentinian to me, if nothing else. So that's so curious that they would kind of arrive at that, and I wonder if that can be just deducted from reading the conventional Bible as it stands. I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my hunch honestly would be to say that like it could be, and I would love for someone to discover like a straight up Gnostic influence at Ephrata. That would be sick.
They
But
have a
I
pretty
think
large
that
library, right?
they have a
Like,
huge library, a huge archive,
I
and it's
haven't been
really
up
hard
there
to
yet,
read.
but
The
Yeah, it's
Pistis
very hard.
Sophia is more common than, like, that was the one Gnostic-ish text that was preserved throughout the history until the Nag Hammadi.
Yeah, I think that one did float around Europe in the 17th century.
Yeah.
So it's not out of the question that Beisel would have read something like that. I do think that like, the sort of like Christian, well, becomes Christian, the biblical creation story in Genesis, right? I mean, it does sort of tell this story of like the world is perfect, and then women are created basically, and there's this like catastrophe. I do think that like um there's a morphological structure to that story that it wouldn't shock me if two separate people read that story and said, "Oh, okay, like, well, we have to like repair this fracture of gender. Like that's actually our work on Earth is to like repair this condition. And I can't restore paradise, but I can like become more androgynous. I can try to do that."
Hmm.
It wouldn't like shock me that two independent Christians had that idea. Um, but it could be that Beisel, I mean, Beisel definitely was in this like mo early modern Christian esoteric like hothouse of literature. And it's certainly possible that something like Pistis Sophia or something influenced by Pistis Sophia came across his desk at some point.
Hmm. Fascinating. Absolutely. I also wanted to ask you about this sort of the vague Rosicrucian claiming of Kelpius at the cave that
yeah.
known as the Kelpius cave. There's that monolithic plaque provided by Amorc. Do you think that's kind of just like spiraling a Rosicrucian legend of
I have a follow-up question to that, which is, are you Team Beverly Hall Corporation or are you Team Amorc?
Yeah.
I got to think of like a political answer to the second question. The first question, yeah, so great question. So, the Rosicrucian manifestos are written or are published early 17th century. So like decades and decades before Kelpius is born. And they they're super cool books. They're like short novels that tell these like exciting stories that are wrapped in this like I would say like hermetic Paracelsian cosmology of like a universe that is imbued with spirit and like a human journey in that universe to like to like sort of like restore the divinity of Earth and to like reach our sort of like spiritual destiny as human beings using these sort of like occult and magical techniques, all of which still in like a thoroughly Christian, albeit like very weirdo Christian frame of reference. And I think like, and also the Rosicrucian manifestos are like bestsellers. Tons of people read them. They're super popular. And I think that people read them and buy them and talk about them because like they are fun and cool to read. They're like exciting books compared to the writings of Paracelsus, which are very hard to read, even if you're, a weirdo who's interested in them. I mean, Paracelsus, I could compare him to a guy like Carl Jung. Tons of interesting stuff to say, a little bit of a slog to get through. So yeah, so they become like this smash hit in Europe. And most importantly, they tell the story of these secret societies, these secret initiatic brotherhoods that have existed for all time and will exist until the end of time. and who kind of like nurture these kernels of like primordial universal religion. Um, so far as we know, these books, so far as we can tell, like they do describe like real like occult, esoteric Christian ideas. They become super, super popular. It's not until the 19th century, so um, the 200 years ago, 200 years after the books are published, that we get real people and groups who call themselves Rosicrucians. We start to get some orders identifying themselves as Rosicrucians. So it's much, much later. Um, this is sort of the consensus right now among scholars who study Rosicrucianism, that there were no actual Rosicrucian fraternities until the 19th century. Now, and so with Kelpius in particular, by the time we get to the 19th century, and there's a bunch of occultists who are interested in Rosicrucianism, they they take a close look at Kelpius. So people like A.E. Waite, the British occultist, actually writes in one book about Rosicrucianism. He says, I read everything by Kelpius I could find. I don't see any Rosicrucian stuff there. And other Rosicrucians come to a similar conclusion. The reason that Kelpius is described as a Rosicrucian is because in the late 19th century, in 1895, a guy named Julius Saxa, who actually was he was like a clothing distributor in Philadelphia in the 19th century, and he did pretty well for himself. He had like a family business selling clothes. I think it was like kind of a department store. And he made a lot of money, and he retired early, and he became an amateur photographer and an amateur antiquarian. And he wrote a book about Kelpius and Company and a book about Ephrata and Company, both of which became like really widely cited among the scholars who looked at these guys. And Saxa identifies all of these people as Rosicrucians. He says, like the Rosicrucian Brotherhood is real, stretches all the way back through history. All these people are examples of it. But if you look at the way that Saxa actually uses the word Rosicrucian in his book, he said at one point, he says straight up, like he says, call Kelpius whatever you want. Call him a Rosicrucian, a Theosophist, a Kabbalist, an Illuminist, a Chialist. He says all these terms basically mean the same thing. And like really, like all of these guys are doing the same kind of like primordial Christian mysticism that we see stretch all the way back to the Bible. So even in Saxa's own writing, it's not at all clear what he means when he says Rosicrucian. I think probably he he sees these sort of like hermetic Paracelsian ideas. He knows those are associated with people who call themselves Rosicrucians, and the term just clicks, but it clicks and it stays. Another kind of interesting thing, in the earlier in the 19th century, there's a Philadelphia novelist. He wrote a book called The Quaker City. Dang, can I remember his name off the top of my head? Let's see, I have the book here. In any case, there's a Philadelphia novelist who writes this fanciful novel about
George Lepard.
George Lepard. Thank you very much. Yeah, George Lepard. Yeah, Quaker author who writes a novel about a sort of like mystical, like fantasy story about early American history, in which basically like the secret machinations of this fraternal brotherhood eventually lead to the birth of George Washington in the Wissahickon Valley, and through their like secret sort of like conspiracies, this brotherhood is able to like usher in the creation of the United States, which brings about sort of like the superior period in world history, and the society that really conspires to create George Washington, kind of like a cool like like Washington as the Kwisatz Haderach kind of thing, is clearly based on Kelpius. They're this brotherhood of monks in the Wissahickon. And so I think following following George Lepard's novel, Kelpius's memory becomes like firmly connected with this idea, really popular in the 19th century, of like secret initiatic brotherhoods. And then Saxa's book comes along and puts this Rosicrucian label on him, and then just everybody cites Saxa for like 120 years. And that's sort of where we are today. So the question,
Amwork's happy to have him.
yeah. So like, was Kelpius a Rosicrucian? Well, like nobody in the 17th century called themselves Rosicrucian. And this analogy might sound flippant, but I think it's true, is like, you know, it takes a couple centuries or a couple decades for good science fiction to become a religion, right? So like we're starting to have like people who are sort like unironically identifying as like Jedi, right? It takes a couple centuries for people to start unironically identifying as Rosicrucians, right? And Kelpius was a little bit too early to do so unironically, even though his personal religiosity was pretty aligned with some of the ideas in the Rosicrucian manifestos, basically like a Hermetic and sort of Paracelsian occult Christianity. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been reading the John Crowley new edition of the Chemical Wedding.
Oh,
And
cool.
his I think I still prefer the Jocelyn Godwin uh, translation because it's a little more heavy on the alchemical citations, kind of positioning it
Definitely.
in that realm. But the Crowley book um, leans very heavily on this idea of it as the first science fiction novel. So that's been in my mind as well. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I didn't realize that that Crowley had made that connection. Yeah, and of course, science fiction, I guess it's like an anachronistic tag to put on it. But I do think that
Yeah.
is, I think that's right. Like I think, science fiction or fantasy or yeah, like fantastic speculative fiction that is like conversant with like the cutting edge of like
Right.
science, philosophy, religion, right?
In
Yeah. Yeah.
with Kelpius, what was the significance of the woman in the wilderness?
Yeah, so the woman in the wilderness is a figure from chapter 12 of the book of Revelations, where, famously in Revelations, part of John's vision is there's a woman clothed with the sun, and and I can't quote it from memory, but while the dragon destroys the world, this woman is hidden and protected in the wilderness. Um, and of course, like it's this apocalyptic text, and it's not really clear at all what John means. Uh, it's a rich kind of like allegorical and metaphorical story. But Kelpius, in almost all of his, I would say, later writings, seems to identify really strongly with this figure of the woman in the wilderness. And he refers to her repeatedly. And he kind of referred in a few letters, he refers to her without telling his correspondent exactly what he means or why he's doing so, which makes me think that like people who are really talking with Kelpius, like he's told them already what he means. Like he talks about this a lot, and he can expect them to know what he means. Um, and so Kelpius, I think in his own decision to kind of like ensconce himself in what he understood as a wilderness or wild setting, um, Kelpius is kind of seeing himself, he really relates to this figure and seems to identify with this figure. I think it's also kind of interesting and notable in a lot of his own religious poetry. Kelpius, the voice that Kelpius speaks from is like a feminine voice, is like the character, the sort of like I figure in a lot of his poems is a woman, which is also sort of interesting. But yeah, he identifies really strongly with this biblical figure who is being protected from a kind of corroding planet during this apocalyptic moment.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
famous his one of his pieces of music is called I love something like I love my God quite alone or something, right?
Yeah,
In the wilderness. Yeah.
there's a few themes in Kelpius's poetry. Yeah, like loneliness, desolation, love, like yearning, like erotic love, um, suffering, and yeah, he has and wilderness. He has one poem which is literally titled in English, "Of the Wilderness," or of the private sufferings of the virgin cross love. And it's like all of his themes, he just like put them in the title.
That's
Yeah.
a good idea.
Tongue
Yeah,
twister.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I'm gonna
he
do
has
that.
yeah, you should. Yeah, he has a couple things that he goes back to. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. That's so interesting. Um, so you didn't answer the question.
I do not have a dog
Yeah.
in the race of
Do you
contemporary
like
Rosicrucianism.
yeah, do you
I love everybody. Yeah.
me too. I do think what do you think of like someone like Pascal Beverly Randolph though? Like that kind of revival of Rosicrucianism and that like Western occult kind of tradition.
Yeah, of course, like I'm sympathetic to a lot of like the like contemporary and like later critiques of a person like Randolph, but also like I said, like I think Rosicrucianism is based on, or the groups that call themselves Rosicrucian is really based on like some science fiction novels from the 17th century. And so my sense of it really is like I don't think there's a primordial Rosicrucianism
Yeah.
that someone can corrupt, right? Or that someone can like debase, and but also like kind of like the style and in history of religions, at least the way I was taught to do it is like um everybody is kind of doing their own thing, and no and even like the traditional systems, the individuals who do them are like innovative and like products of their own time, right? Rather than
Yeah.
um uh, people who are representatives of like an unbroken line of tradition.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, I also don't have a horse in the race, but I like that there's two major factions of Rosicrucians that uh it's like a weird microcosm of the world except through this
They come off pretty
yeah.
different too, if you look
And they're
into
so
them.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. They're
yeah. What's
about
the
very different things.
yeah? I guess the fancy way of describing it is like schismogenesis, where like
Mm.
the more closely aligned you are, like the more intensely you exaggerate your differences to like
True.
Yeah.
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 Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So when you were talking about some of the visions that these people experience, it brought to mind like Betty Andreasen's abduction encounters and the sort of weird quasi-religious alchemical kind of symbols. I mean, I don't know if you've thought about it or if there's someone out there who's done this of looking at the abduction experience and the sort of symbolism and experiences that happen within that sort of like heaven. Has
Yeah.
anyone kind of looked at that?
Um, that's a great question. I'm not familiar with like the specific content. You said the Andreasen abduction?
Yeah, she was in, I mean, her stuff is very particularly Christian mystical, I think.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, like the books were by Raymond Fowler. Um, the Andreasen Affair, I think is, and then there's The Watchers. He has like sort of five books in this recounting of this one woman's abduction experiences. But she's seeing things like enormous worms that turn into phoenixes and stuff like that. Like
Okay.
it's not just gray aliens, although those are there as well. But I just wonder if there's sort of like a groundwork laid for looking at. Obviously, there's a connection between religious studies and the UFO phenomenon, but looking at the abduction phenomenon as a religious experience.
Definitely. I mean, I think like I guess I'm sort of like used to thinking about it in this way already, just like based on like reading people like Whitley Strieber and others who I think actually
Right.
are like pretty into the religious side of things. So far as I can tell, like the abduction experience is like um pretty paradigmatically religious. I think it represents like a pretty amazing and like singular example of the persistence of ecstatic, mystical, and visionary episodes even among even within like a culture that has really tried to secularize itself pretty thoroughly.
Right.
And so I just finished, I guess a couple months ago now, I finished Greg Egan's book, his new like history of the UFO phenomena, which is really good. It's called When the Saucers Came. But he really kind of argues that the abduction experience and the narratives of the abduction experience were really proactively shaped by a handful of people in the late 70s and 80s, people like Bud Hopkins and
Yeah.
other sort of like investigators. Um, and I do think like a lot of it was a lot of the religious content that in some cases was sort of smoothed over to make the accounts seem more like a recollection of like a traumatic, like abduction and whose purpose was like for dangerous med or violent medical research, right?
Yeah.
Um, but honestly, yeah, like you guys have seen the SNL sketch with I can't remember these people's name. You know the one I'm talking about
I think so.
um with Ryan Gosling? Come on, you must have seen the one.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Well, does it have what's her name? It's like relatively recent in terms of SNL.
Yeah, it's like 10 years old. So there's
Yeah.
an SNL sketch with Ryan Gosling where two people are describing their abduction experiences. And one of them is saying like or Ryan Gosling is saying like, yeah, I was brought up into this place and I can't paraphrase it exactly, but he says like I was shown like this bright light of perfect love. And in that moment I understood that like everyone that like me and everyone I know would always be okay. And he's like it's the most beautiful and meaningful experience of my whole life. And then the other person is like, yeah, like she says like, like they undressed her and like manhandled her and then like threw her out the back. And
Yeah.
like the phenomena, it's been a while, like I guess it was like 2017, 2018 when I was reading a ton of abduction narratives, but like they do kind of bifurcate like that, where you have these like just quintessentially like religious, ecstatic sort of experiences. And then these like kind of like dark, strange, um, more like X-Files-y sort of things. But that's
Was
also
it
what,
Kate
go ahead.
McKinnon?
Yeah, Kate McKinnon. It's so
Yeah.
funny.
I
But it's
remember it.
also at least I think like of a weirdly accurate representation of a lot of the literature. But that's also what happened with Close Encounters stuff in the 50s and 60s, where you had, pre Hynek Close Encounters, but on the one hand you had the contactee movement, which in a lot of cases was, like theosophy and like early New Age stuff, but in a spaceship. But then you had like the Hopkinsville goblins and like these other sort of like contact episodes that were far less meaningful, at least in any like interpretable way, and just like more erratic and weird. And that quality, I think, persists through like the UFO phenomena since 1947. This like dichotomy between deeply like meaningful and rich, like spiritual, like positive spiritual experiences with UFOs and their occupants, and then these like way more like erratic and hard to understand and kind of dangerous and violent sort of encounters. Um, yeah,
Yeah. I for some reason the Andreasen stuff came to mind because of its like almost like woodcut kind of quality to how she describes
Mm.
it. Like it sounds like something you'd see in like a volume of illustrated collections of the visions of Saint X, like
Or like
yeah.
whatever.
alchemical texts. Yeah.
Yeah. Or yeah,
Hmm.
sure. Or alchemical texts. Yeah.
Mm.
That's
Um,
cool. I'll have to look that up in more detail. Yeah, that Andreasen isn't ringing a bell, but yeah, it
yeah.
sounds interesting.
She's one of the really interesting abductees, I think, especially where she went afterwards, which was really following the religious trajectory as opposed to the I don't know whatever you call the other way you could go down that path. Um,
Right.
so you had come by the shop a couple of months ago, and you mentioned were you working with some of the letters and like the communion letters archive?
Yeah. Yeah. I was there when we got the some of the first boxes and I helped, put it all together. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. If you've read the paperback that was put out called The Communion Letters,
Yeah.
that's like a sort of like best of collection. But um, yeah, basically when Communion was first published, Whitley included a PO box in the book and basically said like, please reach out if you have like any sort of sense of what this is. And he also, in the first page of the book, there's this poem where he basically says like, I think that a lot of people have like an experience like this in so many words. And apparently they got like like six figures worth of letters, like a huge amount of letters. And
Yeah.
um, the first thing that I think jumps out to most people when they read the letters is and it might sound not nice, but it's true, but the average abductee is not a literary talent like Whitley Strieber. Many of the letters are super hard to understand. And I think also this is actually like, I think this is why a lot of people are pretty like intuitively like suspicious of Strieber, because as soon as you start reading Communion, like if you kind of instantly get this sense like, oh, I'm in the hands of a master storyteller, like that, like
Yeah.
and I think that that is actually maybe like his talent as a writer has led to some suspicion of him. But yeah, like the average person who has an experience like this and this is something that is like true of all mystical experiences. They're impossible to describe. So it's too high of a bar, right? But many of them are very difficult to understand. But yeah, I mean, I wrote about one of the letters in the Big Thicket book. There was one letter from a person who, and I've read this one many times, so I can basically recall it like pretty clearly. He says, when I lived in the Big Thicket, I saw lots of UFOs. He says, me and my family communicated with some of these beings. He says that um, they really were trying very hard to teach him something, but it was very hard for him to like understand what they were trying to teach him. He said that he made a lot of diagrams, but ultimately he didn't really understand what they were diagrams of, so he had to like scrap a lot of that stuff. And he said that oftentimes his room would like fill with pink light and other kind of like just interesting sort of things like that. So um, that's one example of, is it like a paradigmatic UFO abduction experience? Not really. But it is sort of like, it's almost more like now that I'm thinking about diagrams, like the movie Close Encounters, like a UFO encounter prompts this guy to like compulsively try to construct something. Um, and he doesn't know what he's constructing.
Yeah. I like that. It's weird, and I don't want to always bring the conversation back to Eugenia Macer's story, but she's a good example of that, where she had an experience with a beam of light out of something in the sky, and after that, she kind of entered this phase of like extreme productivity, and
Mhm.
It's Phil K.
both,
Dick as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
artistically, just everything, and like maybe it awakened some late psychic abilities, like that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe changing the angle on it a little bit. Have you had any kind of experiences like this? Anything mystical, or are you just sort of,
Oh, good
where are you
question.
coming from?
Um, I once told one time I told a guy who has had a number of like really like intense abduction experiences. He asked me the same question. I was like, no, nothing has ever really happened. And then we were at this like conference together, and then throughout the week, I kept like sort of saying, oh yeah, well I did have like this thing happen and like this thing.
Hmm.
Oh, and like I saw this. And by the end of the week, he was like, dude, you're like a liar. Like you said that you've never had anything happen to you. But yeah, I have mercifully never been abducted by aliens, so far as I know. I have seen a handful of things in the sky that I don't know what they were. Um, I think the probably the most interesting one was one. one evening, I think I was in high school. My mom and I were driving somewhere, and Lebanon is pretty close to this National Guard base called Fort Indiantown Gap. And we sort of saw these like weird lights in the sky, and we assumed for a minute that it was something kind of interesting going on at the gap. So we pulled over to watch. And yeah, it's it's kind of hard to describe, but it was this collection of really bright lights, like brighter than stars, and they were way closer. They were not as far away as the gap. They were obviously I don't know how far they were, but basically they alternated between flying in formation, and then they would sort of like break apart and do what I can only call like playing with each other. They would sort of like, spread apart. One would fly towards another one. It would dart away. Then it would circle back and like kind of like play tag with each other. And then they would get in formation again. And we watched them for like 15, 20 minutes. Um, this was like 2005 or six. Um, I have also, I spent a lot of time on this dirt road in Texas, and I've seen a lot of lights that I don't know what they were. The
Yeah.
really like dramatic Bragg Road light encounter is when you actually see this like basketball sized globe of light either go over or just alongside your car. And I never had that happen. But I've definitely seen the light like move from one side of the tree line to the other, and blink on and off. Um, and maybe I'll hold on to this story for now, but I worked in a haunted library in college, um, and I definitely saw a ghost one night in the library.
Wow.
Yeah, ghosts are real.
Yeah.
No doubt about. Yeah, I don't. I believe that.
You heard it first. Ghosts
Yeah.
are
Cool.
real.
I guess we can start to wrap it up around there. Good, solid conversation. I
Incredible
think,
stuff. Yeah, yeah. That was
yeah,
really
your work
excellent.
on the Pennsylvania mysticism and stuff is really. I think we have a lot of PA listeners. I think that they'll get a kick out of that because I feel like people
Awesome.
kind of undersell how bizarre the state is.
Mhm.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah, I hope so. I hope people are interested in it. Yeah, and I mean one thing that has like honestly piqued my interest in like early American history and held it is like, I'm just interested in weirdos and
yeah.
weird and like weird stuff, and like it's a very like strange time. I think we have this tendency to think of, you know, early America was extremely conservative, and since then we've become more and more progressive and sophisticated. And that ain't always the case, right? Like and so yeah, it's just like a pretty deep well of like interesting stuff. And like I said, like I think like I've only just sort of scratched the surface. And I hope to keep kind of scratching the surface, but like the stuff I've found has just been really, really amazing. And it is like a special place with a special and of course, I didn't know any of this when I was growing up there. Um,
Yeah.
but it is like a special place with a special history. And yeah, for like 100 years, it was one of a very small number of places where the state would not kill you for believing something weird. And so
Huh.
yeah, I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's great. Um,
Um,
cool. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Consensus Unreality.
Well, do you want to give some links to where people can find your stuff as well?
sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
links.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm a huge fan of the show. I think this stuff is awesome. And I
Thanks.
also yeah, I really appreciate like at least in so far as I can tell, there's no place where like there's a literate co-reading of both like esoteric stuff, paranormal stuff, and also kind of like conspiracy slash like parapolitics stuff by two people who kind of know what they're talking about. So I really love the show. I think it's really
Oh,
special and
Hey,
worthwhile.
thank
Brian.
you. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um,
Where do
We're
you
keeping that in.
yeah, we're
nice.
leaving
Yeah.
that in, yeah.
But
Where's
yeah,
your kind of home base online?
I have social media accounts. All of my handles on all of them are T Grieve-Carlson, TGRIEVECARLSON, and I have a website too. But if you just Google my name, you'll sort of see it. I have a website, and I just started a Substack, which I'm not really I don't really know what I'm doing yet, but my idea basically is like I'm just going to post like short pieces of what I'm writing or what I'm working on, and if anybody wants to keep up in that way, yeah.
Perfect.
Cool.
Very cool. Yeah.
All right. Now we'll see you next time on Consensus on Reality.
Beautiful.
All right. Thanks, y'all.